Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the work of the late Professor Stan Metcalfe. His passing this month has been, really recognized with respect across economics. And, he was a big figure. And you brought to my attention a fantastic article by Franco Malerba. It's a tribute to Stan Metcalfe and his contributions to evolutionary theory, Schumpeterian dynamics, and innovation systems. It was published in 2013, and I think it's a really great overview of his work.
Yeah, it's a really nice piece. It celebrates his work, but also positions him as a central figure right from the get-go. Talks about this kind of invisible college of scholars, and, he really had a unique approach. I mean, combining theory and appreciative analysis and empirical work and case studies and across a range of disciplines, not just economics, but also technology, sociology, business studies, and political science. So this interdisciplinary lens is something that really stands out, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And, as Malerba points out, Metcalfe wasn't just working in isolation. He was building on the work of giants, right?
Yeah.
People like Alfred Marshall, Jack Downey, Joseph Steindl, Simon Kuznets. And we're going to be looking at how Metcalfe took these sort of fundamental ideas and developed them in original ways. We're going to be talking about everything from how economies evolve to innovation systems.
That's right.
So to make this manageable, we're going to focus on three key themes that Malerba identifies as really central to Metcalfe's work. First, we're going to look at evolutionary theory and the roles of competition and selection. Then we'll delve into innovation systems and the influence of institutions and entrepreneurship. And finally, we'll examine public policy through this evolutionary and systems lens that Metcalfe really gives us. So first up, we've got this theme of evolutionary theory, Schumpeterian dynamics, and this idea of competition and selection.
Right.
Where should we start with that?
Well, I mean, Malerba highlights this concept of restless capitalism, right?
Right.
That's kind of a very striking image. He's saying, it's a system that's constantly creative and experimental, and it's always searching for improvements.
Yeah.
It's generating innovation and progress, even in the face of very localized challenges. So it kind of captures this dynamic view of modern economies, right? It's not static, it's always changing. Even stability is really kind of this dynamic adaptation.
Yeah, I think that's a really key shift, right? When we think about economics and how we understand economic progress, we often think about things in static terms, like what's the equilibrium, what's the the efficient point, right? But Metcalfe is really saying, no, it's this constant process of change that's actually driving things forward.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is how Metcalfe, as Malerba points out, got into the details of this restless capitalism, right? And his 1998 book, Evolutionary Economics and Creative Destruction, it's a major work. And he argues that change isn't just about things shifting to some equilibrium, it's about population change. So it's about what's the composition of the economy, what are the firms that are operating in this economy.
Right.
And it's driven by two key forces. One is variety creation, that's innovation, entry, and then variety reduction, selection, exit, right? So we have this churn, this constant churn.
Right, and this idea of creative destruction, it comes from the work of the economist Joseph Schumpeter, who really emphasized how innovation constantly disrupts existing industries and creates new ones.
Exactly.
And Metcalfe is sort of picking up on that and saying, yeah, this is really how we should understand economic change.
Exactly. And from that framework, he kind of lays out these three evolutionary theorems. The retardation theorem, the logistic law, and the Fisher-Price theorem. Yeah. Now, the first two, they're kind of they seem fairly straightforward. But this Fisher-Price theorem, Malerba kind of spends a little more time on this, and it sounds like it's got really interesting implications.
Yeah, definitely. What I find really insightful about the Fisher-Price theorem is it suggests that, it's not just how far an industry is from this sort of ideal long-term state of efficiency that drives how quickly it evolves.
Right.
It's about these deviations from the average performance within the industry.
Right. So those differences, those big differences.
Yeah, that's what really powers change.
Exactly.
So for a company to survive, it's not just about being good in some sort of absolute sense. It's about being better than your rivals. You have to be performing better than the others.
Yeah, constantly improving your fitness.
Right. And fitness here isn't, a fixed characteristic.
Yeah.
It's something that emerges from this interplay of new ideas and the selection pressures of the market.
Absolutely. So it shifts your perspective away from thinking about an ultimate goal and more about this constant struggle, this constant effort to be better than the rest, right?
Yeah, it's not about reaching some static ideal. It's about this continuous race to be better than the rest. And Malerba draws a line connecting Metcalfe's work to some key figures in the history of economic thought, right? He mentions Alfred Marshall, Joseph Steinle, and Jack Downey.
Right.
And really highlighting that Metcalfe wasn't developing these ideas in isolation.
Exactly. So, yeah, he really highlights the connection to Marshall's view that the economy is in constant flux. And Marshall's insistence that competition isn't a state, it's a process. It's the series of actions and reactions by business.
Yeah.
And then with Steinle and Downey, the link is this focus on firm heterogeneity, right? The fact that firms aren't all the same. They've got different cost structures, they've got different capabilities, different strategies. And Metcalfe really builds on this understanding of firm heterogeneity to explore how these differences interact with selection and innovation, driving economic change. So it really reinforces that point that, Metcalfe was a giant on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So how did Metcalfe's evolutionary models compared to other sort of prominent approaches in the field? Like, for example, the models developed by Nelson and Winter, right? That's a big name in evolutionary economics.
Yeah.
Malerba sort of touches on that relationship as well.
Yeah, he does. And he really sees Metcalfe's work as being very much in alignment with and complementary to the Nelson and Winter approach. So, both perspectives place selection at the heart of economic evolution.
Right.
And they view the structure of industries as something that emerges over time through these dynamic processes. But Malerba points out that Metcalfe, he places particular emphasis on this relationship between incentives and resources, right? So the incentives that firms face and the resources that they have available. And he also strongly highlights this really tight link, this ongoing link between competition and innovation. And he stresses these feedback loops, right, that make the whole process so dynamic and interconnected.
Yeah, so it's not just about, how efficiently firms can operate. Malerba mentions that Metcalfe actually looked at competition and selection through multiple dimensions.
Right. He broadened our understanding of competition and selection, beyond just efficiency, which is kind of the traditional focus.
Yeah.
He argued that, innovation and growth, these are equally important dimensions through which firms compete and are selected, right?
Right.
And so this broader view kind of naturally leads to this concept of evolutionary trade-offs.
Yeah.
Like, for example, a company might prioritize maximizing short-term efficiency. They want to boost profits today.
Right.
But, maybe that means they're not investing in that radical long-term kind of R&D that might be necessary for survival and growth in the future.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's that classic sort of short-term versus long-term thinking, right?
Okay.
And how do you balance those two things?
Exactly.
And Malerba also emphasizes the importance of what he calls the business unit. So a specific division or segment within a larger company,
Right.
as the primary level at which selection actually occurs.
Right.
Which makes sense, right? Because different parts of a large corporation can face very different competitive environments and pressures.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he also highlights this observation that, entry and exit are not symmetrical processes.
Right.
The rules are not the same. So, the rules that govern how new firms successfully enter a market,
Right.
they're not the same as the factors that determine why and how firms exit.
Right. Okay. Great.
And similarly, expansion and contraction, they also follow their own distinct patterns. So, understanding those separate dynamics, that's crucial for developing accurate models and understanding how industries evolve over time.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. So, Malerba really positions Metcalfe's work as being central to this whole field of evolutionary economics.
Yeah.
Particularly in its focus on this detailed micro-level analysis of firm differences.
Right.
How efficiency and innovation are interconnected, and how these evolutionary processes play out in various industries and under different institutional arrangements.
Absolutely. And he then makes this really crucial point. He's talking about how this detailed focus on variation among firms and these selection processes, right? This micro level, it gives us a link to understanding what's happening at the macro level.
Right.
So, overall growth, development of the economy.
Right. So we're connecting the micro and the macro in a way that, traditional economics hasn't always done.
Exactly. So in Metcalfe's view, this aggregate economic growth, it's not some abstract top-down phenomenon, right? It's emerging from this constant interaction of innovation, investment decisions made by firms, the creation of new varieties of products and services, and these selection pressures we've been talking about.
Yeah, right.
So this links his work directly to these foundational studies on structural change and economic growth by people like Nelson and Winter, Moses Abramovitz, Simon Kuznets, Alan Young.
Right.
And then, the important work of Salomon Fabricant, Luigi Passanetti, Paolo Saviati on, the differing roles of productivity growth in different sectors.
Yeah.
And the influence of income elasticity of demand. So, it's really interesting how all these pieces connect.
It really is. It's a very sort of holistic way of looking at economic growth.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to the second major theme that Malerba highlights in his tribute.
Okay.
These concepts of innovation systems, the role of institutions, and the function of entrepreneurship.
Right.
And I think this is, particularly relevant in today's world, right, where everything is, changing so rapidly and technology is, evolving at such a fast pace.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Metcalfe, he really viewed knowledge growth as a systemic issue, right? So it's not about individual inventors working in isolation, but how knowledge is distributed across different actors. So firms, universities, research institutions, and how this knowledge is embedded in institutions, our social and economic institutions.
Yeah.
And he argued that the dynamism of an economy, that restless capitalism we were talking about, really depends on how these innovation systems come into being, how they develop, how they mature, how they become stable, and ultimately how they adapt and change over time.
Right. So it's not just about having a great idea, right? It's about the whole system that supports that idea and allows it to flourish.
Yeah.
And these innovation systems, as Malerba describes them, based on Metcalfe's work, they're essentially networks, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's complex webs of relationships between individuals and organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. There are these intricate networks of individuals and organizations, businesses of all sizes, academic institutions, government agencies, and they're linked together by established arrangements, what we call institutions.
Right.
And these institutions, they ensure that information and knowledge can flow effectively, throughout the system. And the people in these networks, they collectively kind of determine how knowledge is produced, shared, and utilized. So they define the division of labor in this process of knowledge creation.
Right. And what I find particularly interesting is this point that Malerba makes, that Metcalfe saw these innovation systems as often arising in response to specific localized problems related to innovation.
Right.
And then it's a continuous cycle, right?
Yeah.
As soon as one set of problems is addressed, maybe solved, new challenges and opportunities emerge.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the innovation system itself has to evolve and adapt. And this happens, across both manufacturing and service sectors.
Absolutely. So it's this constant process of identifying problems, developing solutions. And within this process, institutions play a really vital role, right, in facilitating this growth and diffusion of knowledge.
Yeah.
And Malerba emphasizes that for Metcalfe, institutions aren't just these passive background structures.
Right.
They actively store and communicate information, and they support specific types of interactions and collaborations.
Right.
It's like kind of provide these rules of the game, right?
Yeah.
That enable this shared understanding and drive knowledge growth, individual and collective knowledge growth. And he even goes so far as to view markets themselves as instituted devices.
Yeah.
With specific structures, practices, and functions. So, not just an abstract mechanism, but a very kind of concrete, embedded entity.
Yeah, I think that's a really key insight, right? That these institutions are not just sort of, things that are out there. They're actively shaping how we think, how we act, how we, interact with each other.
Yeah.
And so where does the figure of the entrepreneur fit into this systemic view of how knowledge grows and innovation happens?
Well, in Metcalfe's framework, entrepreneurship is really seen as the crucial engine of change, right?
Oh, right.
It's where new knowledge is experimented with, it's combined in new ways, and it's brought to practical application in the economy. And Malerba stresses that this entrepreneurial function, it's not something that exists in isolation. Mm-hmm. It's deeply embedded in this wider network of market and non-market institutions, right? So entrepreneurs, each one has their own unique perspective, their own set of knowledge and beliefs, and that fuels their economic action.
Yeah.
And so that contributes to this overall dynamism.
Right. So it's not just about, the lone genius coming up with a great idea. Yeah. It's about how that idea is then, taken up and developed and spread through the system, right?
Exactly.
And Malerba touches on some broader implications of Metcalfe's work on innovation systems.
Right.
It sounds like it really underscores this dynamic, problem-focused perspective and the idea that the boundaries of these systems aren't fixed or predetermined.
Yeah, exactly. And that focus on problem solving, it introduces this dynamism, right?
Yeah.
It talks about Nelson and Sampad, this idea of social technology, so these organizational routines and practices that actually enhance productivity, right?
Yeah.
And then he links it to Dossie's idea of technological trajectories.
Right.
So, kind of paths that technologies tend to follow, and Metcalfe's emphasis on knowledge dynamics. Well, it means that these boundaries of innovation systems are constantly shifting and adapting.
Right.
So you've got this co-evolutionary process happening between all these different actors who are involved in generating, sharing, and applying knowledge.
Yeah, and it's not solely about the creation and supply of new technologies. Malerba also points out the active role that demand plays in shaping these systems.
Yeah.
So, he says, Metcalfe recognized that consumers aren't just passive recipients of innovation.
Right.
They have different needs, preferences, levels of knowledge.
Yeah, they're heterogeneous.
Right.
And
their own learning processes and existing competencies and goals.
Yeah.
They actively influence these dynamics of innovation systems.
Absolutely.
They shape what kinds of innovations are successful, how they diffuse through the economy.
Exactly. He uses the example of intraocular lenses, so the artificial lenses used in cataract surgery.
Right.
And, he's talking about how the demands of the patients and the surgeons played a major role in guiding the evolution of that technology.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's a two-way street, right? It's not just about the technology pushing forward. It's about, consumers and their demands and their needs actually shaping the direction of that technological change.
Exactly. It's this co-evolutionary process. And he also brings up the geographical dimension, how Metcalfe's perspective helps us move beyond just thinking about national innovation systems.
Right.
So by distinguishing between national ecologies, so this broader set of resources, institutions, capabilities within a country,
right,
and specific innovation systems that operate, maybe across national borders, he kind of allows for a much more nuanced understanding of how innovation happens.
Yeah.
So these innovation systems, they can draw on actors and resources from different national contexts.
Right.
And increasingly, global players like multinational corporations, they operate and influence innovation across multiple national boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, right? Because we often think about innovation as happening within, the borders of a particular country.
Right.
But, increasingly it's this global phenomenon.
Exactly. And that leads directly into this idea of sectoral systems of innovation, right? Where, knowledge and innovation, they emerge from these interactions in specific industries or sectors.
Right.
And these systems can cross those traditional lines, right? National, technological, and industry.
Yeah, yeah. And finally, Malerba connects Metcalfe's discussion of entrepreneurship to this concept of knowledge-intensive entrepreneurship, right?
Right.
Which is, I think a really important point because it highlights the role of entrepreneurs as what he calls knowledge operators.
Yeah, they're not always generating, these huge fundamental scientific breakthroughs out of nothing. But they're very skilled at identifying, accessing, integrating, coordinating existing knowledge from different sources. And through their activity, they often create new knowledge, but crucially, they're embedded in these systems, right? So whether they're operating at local, regional, national, or even sector level.
Yeah, so it's a very sort of holistic, interconnected view of how innovation happens.
Exactly.
All right, so let's move on to that third and final key theme that Malerba discusses in his tribute, which is Metcalfe's perspective on competition and technology policy.
Yeah, sure.
And it sounds like, he had some quite distinctive views in this area as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Malerba emphasizes that, for Metcalfe, the best competition policy is one that's explicitly pro-innovation.
Yeah.
So it's not about maintaining some kind of static structure of markets, but about fostering this dynamic and ongoing process of competition within a supportive institutional environment.
Right.
And the goal is economic growth and development. So this is a big shift from, kind of those traditional approaches to antitrust policy.
Right.
which often just focus on, preventing dominant firms and maintaining a certain number of competitors in a market, right?
Yeah, so instead of just looking at these sort of traditional metrics like market share, concentration ratios,
Right.
Metcalfe's approach would focus on these more dynamic elements of the economy, like, the rate of innovation, intensity of selection pressures, the ease of entry and exit for firms. It's a much more dynamic view of how competition works.
Right. And Malerba highlights that, for Metcalfe, things like exit rules.
Yeah.
How firms can exit a market, that's a crucial aspect of competition policy when you view it as an evolutionary process.
Right.
And when evaluating things like mergers or restrictive practices, the key consideration should be these long-term effects on the dynamism of competition and on overall growth.
Right.
And particularly this impact on the ability of firms to develop new capabilities and introduce innovations.
Yeah, it's a much more sort of forward-looking approach, right? It's not just about looking at what exists now.
Right.
It's about, how do we create conditions that foster innovation and growth in the future.
Exactly. And Malerba also mentions this view of competition policy as being fundamentally based on variety.
Yeah, what did Metcalfe mean by that?
Yeah, so he argued that, in an evolutionary framework, having too much selection pressure, especially when it's coupled with a lack of variety in firms and approaches,
Right.
it can stifle progress. If you eliminate too many different approaches too quickly,
Right.
you lose that trial and error process that drives innovation.
Yeah, you kind of narrow the field too much too early.
Exactly. And, you end up with an industry maybe dominated by a single firm, and they've got this very limited perspective. And this, kind of echoes some of the concerns that Richard Nelson raised about, the potential downsides of monopolies.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
And how did this evolutionary and system-based way of thinking, how did it influence Metcalfe's perspective on the role and design of technology policy?
So similar to his approach to competition policy, his view on technology policy moves beyond those standard market failure justifications,
Right.
which often focus on things like, the under-provision of public goods or the presence of externalities.
Right.
So instead, he kind of placed dynamic change and long-term development at the forefront.
Right.
All within this evolutionary and system-wide perspective. And, technology policy, in his view, needed to pay attention to those interrelationships between fields of knowledge,
Right.
the importance of experimentation, and those institutional settings that could support sustained innovation. So it's really about, setting the stage for innovation to flourish.
Right. And so Malerba then introduces this concept of evolutionary and system failures as the key rationale for public policy intervention in the realm of technology.
Right.
What does that mean?
So because Metcalfe saw competition as a process and innovation as a systemic phenomenon,
Right.
he argued that policy becomes necessary when you've got those evolutionary trade-offs or lock-in situations
Right.
that actually hinder the development and diffusion of new technologies or block innovations, potentially beneficial innovations, right?
Yeah.
So this means that technology policy, it should be aiming to foster the development of advanced knowledge and the underlying scientific and technological infrastructure.
Right.
Improve the connections and flows of information within innovation systems by encouraging collaboration
Right.
and ensuring better coordination across government policies. So it's really about, connecting those different parts of the system and making sure they work together effectively.
Right. And what are some of the sort of practical implications of this perspective for policymakers who are trying to promote technological advancement?
So, Malerba outlined several important implications. One is this need to address those inherent evolutionary trade-offs, right? So like balancing exploration of new ideas versus exploiting existing knowledge.
Right.
Or the tension between creating variety and then efficiently selecting.
Right.
So policies can help firms escape what are called competence tracks, where they become kind of stuck relying on outdated technologies and ways of doing things.
Right.
And they can do this by supporting basic research, upgrading the skills and capabilities of the workforce,
Right.
and using public procurement to create early demand and nurture the development of new technologies. And timing of interventions is also crucial, right?
Yeah.
Particularly in industries that exhibit, path dependency and network effects.
Right.
There might be a relatively narrow policy window to influence things.
Right.
Paul David made this point.
Yeah, it's that classic sort of policy window idea, right? Where you have this limited time to really make a difference.
Right. And then there's always the challenge of, governments picking the right technologies to support.
Right.
Which Malerba refers to as this blinder giant quandary, drawing on Paul David again.
Yeah. And especially, in these early stages of development, policymakers don't always have the knowledge or the foresight to accurately assess the long-term potential and impact of these new technologies.
Right.
So it makes it really difficult to make informed decisions about which ones to support. And of course, within this system's view, it's also crucial to consider the potential side effects and unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Of any intervention in one part of the system, because it's going to have ripple effects elsewhere.
Exactly. And so, it's a much more comprehensive and dynamic approach than just trying to correct isolated market failures. And Malerba emphasizes that public policy also has a role to play in supporting the transformation of existing systems, or even facilitating the emergence of new ones, by addressing those mismatches between different actors. And finally, he even touches on the competence of the policymakers themselves within this evolutionary framework. They operate with bounded rationality, they learn over time, they've got different levels of expertise, and all of this can lead to policy failures.
So it's a reminder that policymakers are human, right? They make mistakes. They're not omniscient, and we need to be aware of that when we're thinking about how to design and implement effective technology policy. So, as we've seen from this deep dive into Franco Malerba's tribute, Professor Stan Metcalfe was a really influential thinker. His work provides us with this powerful framework for understanding how economies evolve, how innovation happens, and the role that both competition and public policy play in creating a more dynamic and progressive economic system.
Absolutely, yeah. That emphasis on this interplay between variety and selection, that systemic view of innovation, that forward-looking approach to competition and technology policy, these offer so many insights, and they remain very relevant today.
Yeah, they really do. And, Malerba ends his tribute on a more personal note, reminding us that beyond being, this giant of scholarship, Metcalfe was, he was described as an exquisite person with a great sense of humor and a real passion for life. He even recalls his spirited participation in debates about the 2006 World Cup.
That's right.
So, he was clearly a multifaceted individual. And so, on Revise and Resubmit, we want to extend our deepest condolences to the family, friends, and colleagues of Dr. Stan Metcalfe, who passed away this month in March 2025. His contributions to evolutionary economic theory, Schumpeterian dynamics, and innovation systems have really left a lasting mark on the field, and his ideas are going to continue to shape our understanding of economic change for many years to come.
For sure.
So, and don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.